Good evening. Welcome to the first Baumer conversation of the spring 2021 semester. My name is Andrew Cruse. I'm an associate professor of architecture and will host tonight's conversation with LEVENBETTS. Today, we inaugurated a new president and a new vice president. This event, one that has historically been cause for celebrating democratic norms and traditions, is surrounded by a lot of anxiety and confusion. Over the past weeks, months, and possibly years, many of us have felt an increased presence of politics in our lives. The politics of the pandemic, the politics of social justice, the politics of state and national capitals. Tonight's speakers, Stella Betts and David Leven, expressed some trepidation about speaking today, a day when national events threaten to eclipse smaller ones like this one. We decided to go forward with the conversation, not in spite of the potential problems, but because it's important to talk about architecture in a political context, because it's important to talk about architecture and politics. Architecture is certainly no stranger to politics, from Le Corbusier's choice of architecture or revolution, to architecture students' claim that beneath the pavement there's a beach. Architects have often engaged in larger political movements. But beyond these memorable expressions, it can be hard to translate such large ideas to the everyday practices of architectural design. In a conversation with Stella yesterday, she talked about a politics of space that LEVENBETTS are pursuing in their work, something that I think makes this conversation tonight very relevant to today's events. This is a politics of space more anthropological than geographical, one that takes on questions of privacy, publicness, media, and hygiene as political topics embedded in the everyday operations and ordinary aspects of architecture. Architecture as a profession relies on norms, standard practices, and collective wisdom to build durably, economically, and in ways that delight. Buildings are expensive, and owners want assurances, warranties, and guarantees that they will weather and work as they were intended to. But often such norms and standards have their own politics that are hard to see and harder to do something about in the rush of the design process. I've started to wonder, what if there was a way to test implicit bias of a door or understand the stereotype of a stairway, a way of investigating a politics of space that's also a poetics of space? I know that LEVENBETTS are asking similar questions. LEVENBETTS was founded in 1997 after Stella graduated from the GSD and David from Yale. A little over 10 years later, in 2009, LEVENBETTS published their first monograph, Pattern Recognition. The book opens with their essay in which they describe a view looking down at the landscape from the window of an airplane, an experience most of us have not had for many months and may not have for a while. In their new monograph, 13 Ways of Looking at a House, they take another more intimate vantage, looking at houses, 13 of them to be exact. And although the 13 houses in the book are projects from their office, the title refers to a poem by Wallace Stevens, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. Stevens' poem was, in his own words, to look at the resemblance between things. For him, that was blackbirds. For LEVENBETTS, that's houses. I think you will see this evening how, through this close process of looking, LEVENBETTS reveals, exposes, and discovers much that is political and poetic about the spaces that they design. Please join me in welcoming David Leven and Stella Betts.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Andrew,
that was a really amazing introduction.
Yes, I hope we can speak as eloquently. And thank you, Eric Herman, as well, for the invite. We're excited to be at the Knowlton School of Architecture to give this presentation and to have the opportunity to have this discussion with you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Great. And I just want to make sure that you can see if I advance. Is that advanced? Great. Okay.
Great.
So why don't you go ahead?
The title, as Andrew so eloquently introduced, is 13 Ways. We are so interested in this idea of a multiplicity of ways of looking at things. As was stated, The title comes from this poem by Wallace Stevens from 1917. It's also the title of 13 Ways of Looking at a Black Man from 1997 by Henry Louis Gates Jr. The two authors look at things, whether it's the topic of, well, a lot of things. In Wallace Stevens, the relativistic view, the man and the woman looking at the landscape, the blackbird looking, the landscape as a subject looking back. And in Henry Louis Gates, different ways of looking at a highly racially charged subject. So this is, for us, as we get to design and as architects, and I really appreciate the introduction, it's, how do we connect design and architecture with politics, because they can be sort of seen as so separate, and it's very well stated. How do you actually do it? What does it mean? Where do politics end up in design? For us, it happens in a lot of ways. It really has a lot to do with these issues of equity and openness and decisions that we as designers can make and have to make. And the decisions that we make have a huge impact on the way people experience space, social dynamics occur around those. So this sense of openness in architecture and an idea of open architecture is really kind of a platform that we talk about a lot. And we're going to discuss that in these projects coming up.
Yeah, so we're going to frame the discussion based on this idea of the politics of space and looking at kind of macro to micro. But first, we just want to introduce our practice a little bit. We work at a kind of wide range of scales, from urban planning to large-scale buildings, houses, smaller buildings in the city, and then to art installations and furniture. But for today, we are going to speak specifically about the spaces of learning and spaces of living as a way to kind of frame our discussion. But also just taking a step back, we are practicing in New York City. We're in Chelsea in the Arts District, and our building is full of galleries. And one of the things, there's many ways to also structure a practice. And one of the things that we did about 1.5 years ago is we took our conference room and we have several times a year, turn it into a gallery. And so we just had a couple of shows last year, and we had a couple of new shows that were about to start when COVID hit. So we're looking forward to when we can start the gallery again. And maybe not very creatively, the name of the gallery is called Conference Room. And it's a gallery not of our, to show not our own work, but to show colleagues. It's an informal architecture gallery that talks about ways of process as well, not just finished work.
We like to talk about the conference room's mission as really cracking open the issues of the how and why of things. Mm-hmm. So people whose work is not necessarily in process, but about process. Mm-hmm. And so you might walk into that gallery and be able to understand, like, oh, that's how something else works that I hadn't thought about.
So as part of the sort of two headings this evening about spaces of learning and spaces of living, we'll start with spaces of learning. Free libraries are something that's very, very important to us, and we've been fortunate enough to work on several libraries. They are, from a sort of political standpoint, they're one of the few really last standing free civic spaces that offer a series of free services. And the program of the library, of the free library, is changed radically over the years. And looking a little bit quick step in history, looking at Le Proust with Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève from 1850, kind of noted as one of the first public libraries, mostly because of the invention of the gas light, and the library was able to stay open in the evening for students, and so they opened it up for university students to study. And then OMA's library in Seattle, which really cracked open the program of the library beyond the sort of conventional container of books, but much more of a kind of larger community center. Here locally in the States, well, actually more internationally as well, beginning in the 1880s, the Scottish American philanthropist Andrew Carnegie began his campaign of free libraries throughout the US, as well as the UK, Ireland, and Canada, and many other parts of the world. He located these libraries in small urban centers and underserved neighborhoods, as well as in large cities. It is important to note that during the period of segregation in the US, where African American citizens were denied entrance to public libraries, Carnegie circumvented the law and financed separate libraries for the African American population. And with over 2,500 libraries built over the course of nearly 50 years, Carnegie provided access to books and education to communities outside of major cities. So with that, we are working on our 5th library. We've 4 in Brooklyn, and we're starting our 5th in Queens. And so these are the plans of the 5 libraries, and it's not actually a coincidence that they're all about 8,000 square feet. That's about the size of a branch library in one of the New York boroughs. Some of them are more than 1 story. But for us, it's really interesting to have worked and are working on 5 libraries that are very similar in terms of their kind of size and in a general sense in terms of their program, but they each have their own identity. They're each different because of the community they serve, because of the environment, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. One of them's in a flood zone, and programming, and the sort of identity of each library and what each group of librarians, what's the directive. So these are the 5 libraries they've been working on, and we're going to speak about 3 of them tonight, starting with the Brooklyn Heights Library in Brooklyn.
Brooklyn Heights was meant to be an interim library while Brooklyn Public Library System built their permanent library. It's in an historic building, and the challenge was to leave an imprint of this temporary library while making it feel like a place that people wanted to be, so it didn't feel so temporary. This is a picture before. This is not the design that we did for the library. It's in the parish hall. As you can see in the figure ground, it's sort of shoehorned into the site behind the sanctuary, the church, and between the sanctuary and the parish house. So it was kind of slightly hidden. So how do you give identity, and what is that identity? The other part of this was because it was an interim library, we had to use an economy of means to really pull off a project that could be built efficiently, not expensively, and actually quite quickly. This project was 1 year from start of design to completion of construction, which in New York City is phenomenally fast. So what you're seeing here is a model where the design gesture was this sort of worming wall, and I'll show this in a plan in a minute, affectionately known as the bookworm or the worm wall. And this gesture allowed us to just accommodate some private and semi-private spaces, staff offices, and a gathering area, while then celebrating the larger space of the library. The materiality of the project was conceived to bring as much light into and through the spaces as possible. And because it's a library and we love text and words, we were using the poem by one of the favorite sons of Brooklyn, which is Walt Whitman. And this poem called Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, we applied to this translucent material in a sort of a drawn out, we kind of manipulated, or didn't manipulate, just remained faithful to the stanzas, but dragged out the poem along about 100 feet. So in order to read the poem, you'd have to kind of keep returning, which is an absurdist activity, which lends itself to a kind of another absurdist activity, which is reading snippets of a poem that wouldn't necessarily be put together sort of in a John Cage style, another great American poet. So seeing through these spaces, seeing through Whitman's words, the library would hold events, readings of Whitman's poetry, and then this sort of the back alley entrance into the church, again, imprinted on the wall.
So continuing with our libraries is the East Flatbush Library, also in Brooklyn. This is currently under construction. And here's an existing photo again that is not our design.
Yeah. This is actually a mid-'80s renovation of a 1950s building. The 1950s library was sort of half this site So it was expanded, but it was a kind of an optimistic plate glass, open to the street kind of affair. This was more of a defensive glass block and sort of smoked skylight situation, where only this sort of diffuse natural light went into the staff offices, while the main reading room was only lit by artificial fluorescent light. So not a very welcoming or elevating experience wherein one could go to elevate oneself.
So starting with the facade, actually, the first move for us was to just completely open up the facade and create a more welcoming front face to the community, to bring them into the library and to have it be more of a connection to the community. So a large open face with also some access into the multi-purpose room. So the sort of communal activity, the multi-purpose room is basically used as a community space. It's an articulated facade that's a sort of pleated facade that has a lenticular graphic on it that reads very subtly, East Flatbush when you're walking on one side of the street, and then library when you're walking from the other side of the street. Do you want to talk about the panels?
Yeah, these are just a couple of images of the assembly of that facade, the folded metal, the graphics being applied to the different sides of the folds, clip details, creating assemblies that were efficient to build. There's only one pattern, but it's flipped, so you get two patterns, which then creates variation. These are mock-ups. The one in the middle and the one on the left are actually mock-ups that we made just out of chipboard in our office on a curved jig. And the picture on the right is actually the mock-up of the facade in the folded metal that we just approved recently. And are quite excited about.
So going from the outside to the inside, kind of thinking about the traditional libraries of these naturally lit central reading rooms, the way that we decided to organize the library itself was to create, again, a kind of centrally lit reading room, and keeping in mind that it's only an 8,000 square foot library, so we had to also be efficient with space. But here's where, again, some of the politics of the space come into play. We decided, both from an efficiency of layout standpoint, to eliminate all the corridors. But what that also did was it eliminated this sort of back of house where the staff is in one area and the patrons are in another. Everyone is circulating in and amongst and through this centrally, naturally lit reading room. And so all the support spaces, whether they're staff or patrons of meeting rooms, restrooms, offices, are all surrounding this centrally lit space. So it's very kind of democratic in that sense. And all the rooms are facing this central naturally lit reading room, and the librarians have views. So here you see we're adding 3 very large north-facing skylights that are bringing natural light into the space. And then those perimeter rooms are lined essentially with a translucent material so that there's also shared light within all of those surrounding rooms. So an idea of equity of light as well, and sort of all spaces being treated and created equal. These are some photos of our recent construction. You can start to see the skylights framed out and starting to open up. The library is supposed to be done the end of the summer, early fall. The third library that we want to share with you is one in Red Hook, also in Brooklyn, but in a very different neighborhood and in a very different, actually, climate zone based, even though still in Brooklyn. And this, again, we'll show you some photos of the existing building originally, but this one also incorporates actually a garden and a way in which we're able to open up the facade. We're going to take a step back and give you a little bit of a background of the existing site.
So as Stella said, the neighborhood is called Brooklyn. It's called Red Hook. The borough's Brooklyn. Red Hook has traditionally been a very industrial neighborhood. It's had a lot of residential pressure recently. In the past, you're seeing the Red Hook houses here. This is one of the kind of probably the first or second New York City Housing Authority projects that was built in the 30s under Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. NYCHA was a critically important project and still is, and houses about 8% of the city's population. the largest landowner or landlord in the country. So it's houses about 6,000 people, predominantly African American, and this is their library that has been sort of tucked away and hidden and is not terribly visible to them. And that's what the librarians say to us. It's also in a pretty severe FEMA flood zone. So when Superstorm Sandy hit, it created a lot of damage to the library. The library renovated minimally. They got up and going again, but the FEMA codes and the New York City flood codes have been rewritten, and this library and this project, because it's such a drastic renovation, have to meet those codes happily. This is a picture of the existing library. Again, the one-story, 8,000 square foot box that Stella was talking about. There are a whole series of these libraries built in the late 60s, early 70s under the Mayor Lindsay administration. And so they are affectionately known as Lindsay boxes. They're often challenged for light. There's a garden on the back side of this. You'll see on the left side of the image where the vines are growing down the solid wall. There's a library with a garden and a solid wall between them. So there's no consciousness between the two spaces of this opportunity to sort of create a relationship between nature and building.
So you can see it in this interior shot where you have no connection to the street, is what David's saying. You have little to no natural light except for in these sliver windows. That's electric light that's from the ceiling, and no connection to this sweet little garden that's on the side. So that was the charge for us, is to open up the library and make a connection to the garden, within the challenge of also it being in a flood zone. So we have to dry flood proof the building, which essentially means you need to kind of create walls that can resist the water and the hydrostatic pressure of a pending flood. So starting off, we opened up the library, and as we moved the entry to the corner, because that image that David was showing of the existing library at the corner, and really created some openness and transparency if you're walking along the sidewalk that you see all the way through the library to the garden.
As Stella was saying, that entry door, then occupies and addresses this really important nexus, this corner. There's several streets coming into this corner in the neighborhood. So moving that entry toward the corner, it's a kind of a simple move, but a sort of a massive urban gesture, we would contend.
The building is made out of brick, and it really is a play on the sort of solid void, because again, we have to both address the sort of dry flood proofing of the building as well as the desire for it to be open and transparent. And in Red Hook, there's many brick buildings, so we're playing off the brick of some of the existing buildings, but also then doing a pattern of brick that we'll show you in a moment that is distinct from those. So the identity of the library. So this brick pattern is basically like a basket weave that is applied to the new facade of the building. And then here, as you see, the building's also stepped up a little bit, but still the water level will go up beyond the height of these steps. And you see some of the elevations of the building, creating a lightness with the brick. So both from an illumination standpoint, but also from a kind of denying the heaviness of the materiality of brick as well on the facade, and some of these details of what we're kind of calling this sort of basket weave. And we have a few details here to show you.
The brick is actually, it's not clay brick, it's actually concrete brick. And the manufacturer has several different sizes. So we played with those sizes to create this bond pattern that allowed us to make the sort of traditional solid wall that a brick wall is, as well as to perforate that wall. So by simply sliding the brick out where the wall passes up above the parapet, or there's an opportunity for openness, the brick becomes a screen, as opposed to the solid brick wall that it is when it is a wall and insulated.
And then those were images of some mock-ups in our shop of just kind of assembling the brick, and then some images of the interior that then be looking towards that garden. So again, as part of this learning spaces, we also have been fortunate enough to do some work at Cornell University, and to some degree similar to the program of the libraries. The spaces, academic spaces and education spaces, has also changed pretty dramatically. We're finding this idea of cross-disciplinary certainly has been around for a long time, but in terms of space making and architecture, the spaces are kind of catching up to that idea, and we're finding a lot of overlap and less siloed departments, but more shared spaces and more crossover of different departments. So we're going to show you a couple of projects from Cornell University, starting with Sibley Hall, which is for the architecture school. It's with the upper floor of Sibley that's adjacent to OMA's Milstein Hall. And I'm going to start with thinking about an idea of light. This is a quote from Michael Sorkin's book, Local Code, where he says the purpose of the heliotrope regulations is to guarantee access to sunlight and to a direct relationship to the sky, which is considered in all spaces of human use. So in other words, a right to light. In New York City, for instance, residential code, there's a requirement to what is we call legal light and air. But outside of the residential code, spaces for work and study do not necessarily require light. So we like to ask the question, what if every working space was required to have some access to light? What if form followed photon? And how would that change the built environment? So again, an idea of politics, like everyone has a right to light. So that is a lot of a driving concept, really for all of our projects, but just a way in which we're kind of framing some of the projects here for Cornell.
So the project obviously sits amongst a grouping of academic buildings on the Cornell campus, and we were interested in just kind of understanding where the spaces sat and kind of who moves through those spaces, so that the design would be considered as part of a network, essentially, as opposed to being just sort of an isolated incident in a campus. It had been a pre-existing attic space. Rather structurally compromised. We added three steel frames that sort of telescope down the space that replaced heavy masonry shear walls, and in the smallest case, the side of the dome of the building itself, which, by adding the steel and opening up the movement through the space, then academic exchange between faculty, students, crit spaces, desk spaces could be encouraged. So it's sort of a free-flowing space as a function of adding this sort of consistent structural maneuver down through the project.
And this idea of shared light, so this is a corridor between the sort of faculty offices, but we decided to widen the corridor to invite ad hoc informal program. They often set up gallery spaces here, or during final reviews, this becomes a space of making extra models. But even the facade of the faculty offices, where there's a translucent glass walls that create shared light to the skylight as well as to the windows. And then this last image of the project, just going back to David's, the idea of the connection, really an interior campus that's connecting Milstein and Rand and Sibley Hall, and creating these connections between the buildings to incorporate a more open and communicative environment. So this second project from Cornell was for the Department of Computer Sciences. And this too was a slightly compromised project in terms of light that David's going to talk about in a moment.
Located in an 80s Guatemala Siegel building that was largely conceived around this idea of long spine hallways with spaces off of the corridors, and a kind of a color palette indicative of the era. We looked at a whole different way of thinking about the siloing or the opening up, let's say, of academic space to these pathways that people in campuses always course through.
And this idea of the corridor, and we, in his book, Translation from Drawing to Building, Robin Evans compares a Palladio villa, compares a Palladio villa from the 16th century to an English villa of the 17th century. And he notes how the lack of the corridor in Palladio created an enfilade environment where activities are overlapped and circulation and lived space are collapsed. Versus in England at the far right, about a century and a half later, the introduction of the corridor separated the servant class from the served. So here the politics of the corridor are at work, creating separation or creating overlap.
So in the Rhodes Hall project, a two-story scheme with the computer systems laboratory on the left, and the what was called, it was a distance learning, smart distance learning classroom on the right that we're going to talk about in a moment. But this idea of opening up the corridor. So this view is taken from the corridor, and we replaced the mauve sheetrock walls with these glass walls with a sort of a punch card pattern, a nostalgic move, I guess, if you will, that allowed this transparency and this visibility, this understanding of what's going on inside these unbelievable departments where innovation is taking place.
And also to allow the light that's coming from the window wall go all the way deep into the corridor. So again, an idea of shared light that we just talked about with Sibley, that even the hallway has a right to light and to views.
So this visibility to the light from all the different spaces, to the outside landscape, which was spectacular. But light, especially in many months of the year in Cornell, in Ithaca, is challenged. So pulling as much light as possible through the perimeter spaces to the working spaces.
And then having both communal spaces and individual spaces of meeting, so acoustically isolated, but visually connected as a way of creating a kind of more communal and overlap of program.
In the classroom on the second floor of this project, as you can see in that back window, looks out onto the corridor. Once again, here it is. So looking, people are passing by while this class is going on, able to see the screen, able to understand what's happening, yet still being acoustically isolated and able to focus on the tasks and learning at hand.
We're going to go really quickly through a third project that we have been working on, which is Comstock Hall, and it's a combination of many different departments into one building and addition that's a lab building.
So this is the lab building of sort of a forbidding brick facade. The challenge was to combine these departments to open this up as a campus hub. The addition on the right, the white grid, the darker existing building still with the solid wall, so able to play off that. The definition of quad spaces through the use of this addition, but really making it a campus hub. Students cut through this building as it is now, and then so understanding that pattern of use and circulation made us think about how to formalize, how to establish that space as something really a hub-like place. This sort of piece jutting into the rear quad, defining that quad space, bridging over the lower plinth of this building, and then in these interior views, engaging the section, cutting out slabs, especially in this view, graphics exhibiting the identity of each of the different departments. So this sort of consciousness while establishing identity through the spaces.
So we're just going to quickly talk now about our houses. We've been fortunate enough to work on several houses over the course of our practice. And as Andrew noted, we are currently working on a book called 13 Ways of Looking at a House. So we're obsessed with our 13 ways. And in the book, we're using 13 of our houses as a case study and doing comparisons, scale-to-scale comparisons of site, looking at plot and lot diagrams and diagrams of the houses themselves. But also, I think maybe in some ways, and maybe more importantly for us, we're really taking apart the house. We start by looking at campsites and the most informal, basic version of domestic space that is the most simple elements. So we have different sections in the book, and we're talking about campsite. We're also taking apart the sort of elements of domestic space as a way to challenge norms. And I think Andrew was, through our conversation yesterday, was alluding to that in the intro, and in terms of, we look at plumbing and not necessarily thinking that plumbing is installed in conventional ways. We're looking through film and artists. Doors, as Andrew mentioned, even looking at something, a Duchamp door, the politics, if you will, of a door swing, which room does it privilege, which direction does it imply, so a swing door versus a sliding door, within these elements, and taking apart the most basic elements of the house. A stair in the filmmaker John Cassavetes, in several of his films, scenes take place in the stairwell. It's as much a room as any other space in the house, so it's not necessarily just a place of passage. So through that lens, we look at 13 elements of the house in the book, so that's just a little sampling. We're going to show you a house in Hillsdale that's really, the concept of the house is really about a pavilion, like a campsite pavilion in the landscape, and with a series of volumes, programmatic volumes that sit under this roof and columns. And it's really looking at Mondrian's Pier and Ocean painting from 1915 that really was inspiring to us in terms of a way of organizing the house through a series of perpendicular volumes. So not really creating enclosure, but at the same time able to maintain privacy. These are some early models where we're literally taking volumes. We're taking the lines from the Mondrian painting and turning them into volumes that mostly have storage or bathrooms, and just assembling them in a perpendicular pattern, creating privacy without creating enclosure. So this idea of openness, also ambiguity. It's not prescribed in terms of how the house is the rooms are necessarily used. And you'll see in this house, as well as the one that we're going to show you, there's not really a formal front door or back door. You enter the house at any one of the rooms. It's completely porous. It's kind of non-hierarchical in that sense. So this is the diagram of the house with these volumes. And the plan itself, again, some of the volumes are bathrooms, but most of the rest of them are storage and kitchen support. And so you want to talk a little bit about the construction?
Slab on grade on top of this hill, and you can see the slab kind of establishing the indoor and outdoor spaces, wood framed, spanning across these volumes that Stella was talking about. The architecture perforates through in some of these spaces with this, and really tries to explicate these volumes as much as possible. So this very, very skinny flat roof sits on top of these volumes. So it's quite clear that the volumes are essentially inserted underneath this roof, and a whole series of extremely skinny columns kind of orbit around the space to hold up the roof, essentially, and deal with the gravity of that roof.
And a series of apertures that let light in from above, both inside and outside, as well as in some of the bathrooms. So there are skylights that are part of the outdoor patio spaces as well. So very kind of porous, both in a sort of horizontal direction as well as from the roof. And then lastly, Square House, which is in Stone Ridge, New York. This, again, if you think about our plumbing image, it's square, so it's non-hierarchical. You can enter, there's no main facade. Plumbing jumps outside. You can wash your hands after running around outside, or do some after doing some gardening. This is the roof plan. On the roof, there's basically a informal like campsite or deck where they also have a vegetable garden. So here again, porosity. Every room is created equal in the sense of that you have a door. There are no windows in the house. Every room gets a door. So even all bathrooms, you basically kind of go from outside straight into the bathroom, almost like an outhouse. A nice one, we think. And just the idea that it's with plumbing. So a very simple plan in many ways. And this were some of the photos of the original models. We actually made the models with stacking chipboard, and then that kind of gave us the idea of the board form concrete. These are some photos from the construction, which the formwork was almost as equally beautiful to the idea of the project. We really enjoyed that part of the process. So these are the four facades, basically all the same. You can enter the house on all four facades. And here's, as you see, a view from an interior, an example of a bedroom where it's just a pocket door where then you can walk outside.
And create this relationship between indoor and outdoor with the slots, and then the diagram going out into the landscape to become apertures in stone walls. This stair going up to the roof, another sort of, extremely reductive stair taking you up to the vegetable garden campsite on top. The house is really designed a lot, in deference to this bathing area at the back of the house that also opened up completely to a moss garden. This kind of like running the patterns across, with the glass interrupting is a big part of this, drawing this relationship between the indoor spaces and the outdoor spaces that are directly adjacent. and then just views into the building at night, seeing the stepping down with the landscape, the section of the building, it follows the slope of the land. The roof is flat throughout, but the space is actually telescoped from rather short to quite tall as they move across the landscape. And then this another view from above, but in the snow, just shows the kind of, the abstraction of the square sitting in the landscape, the cut of the landscape wall, and the rather tall trees orbiting around just a simple square building.
That's it. Thank you.
Do we stay on time?
Pretty much. Yeah,
Good.
Thank you very much. That was a fantastic series of projects and presentations.
Thanks.
I guess looking at the two types of projects, the libraries and the houses that you presented, it seems like the libraries, you're working with existing conditions, and the houses are all new builds. And even though a lot of the strategies that you use cross between those two types of projects, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about approaching an existing project, an existing building that you're going to reimagine versus a new project that's sort of made from scratch.
Well, I mean, it's a great question. And it's interesting because in many ways, from a construction standpoint, it's much more difficult to deal with the existing conditions. We're often dealing with these older buildings. At the case of, like Sibley, it's a historic building, but then a lot of the libraries in New York City, even from the 70s and 80s. And so that's kind of a little bit of can often be a bit of a rat's nest to kind of figure that out. And there are constraints, right? In terms of those constraints. And then, like the one East Flatbush Library, it's basically an infill building, whereas Red Hook's on the corner. So there are opportunities. On the other hand, what's amazing, so in a way that's the difficult part, what's the exciting part, and is that there is already a community, there's already a neighborhood. Actually we spend most of the time with the libraries, we spend most of our time trying to get familiar with the community and having meetings with librarians and sort of understanding what the identity of the library is. Whereas with the new projects, it's more of a challenge to become familiar with the landscape and to understand other constraints, but constraints based on the environment and light and views and those types of challenges.
The new buildings are, the houses are the place where we kind of can really experiment, with some formal ideas, with some organizational kind of concepts, and both are fantastic. But the houses are really like these little kernels because they're limited in size. You can kind of work out some of these ideas. You can see that our work is not overly formal, we would argue, but we love form, and we like to kind of work out, geometries, let's say, and just a whole series of kind of, fine calibrations of the residential brief, if you will, within these little buildings. But I think the existing buildings, like Stella said, it's about understanding the constraints and then really speaking to the community and the design. Obviously we come in with things that we're excited about and want to do, especially when it comes to finishes and facades, but kind of the design coming out of these conversations.
I think it's exactly that, because I think, I think our desire, and it goes back again to the sort of politics, is that, the last thing we want to do is parachute in with our preconceived ideas of what from a library should be, or what an education space should be, or a preconceived idea of what a house should look like. So, to some degree, I think our projects look very different, but that's because they come out of a conversation with the client, out of a community, or out of a response to a site condition that then, maybe invites a kind of different approach to a materiality. So I think the most important thing is whether it's everything is existing, even when we're kind of coming to a new site for a house. It's still about a landscape that has a history, and being respectful and mindful of that history, and participating.
Yeah, I can definitely see the idea of the new build site or the new build house rather, on a rural site is actually quite a rich site, in a way that maybe an urban site is also quite rich, but in very different ways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Another, shifting gears a little bit, just to the structure of your practice. I mean, you obviously have an active building practice. You both also teach. I didn't include an introduction, but it was part of the email that went out advertising the lecture. You run a gallery out of your office, and then you obviously publish. So it's a sort of a lot of balls to keep in the air, or maybe a different venues in which to explore ideas and audiences to address those ideas too. Could you talk a little bit about those different avenues of how you built your practice and how you talk about ideas?
Well, we started.
We don't sleep very much. No one does.
We started by building, actually. We kind of, wanted
Maybe
to just.
our background too is just unconventional.
Yeah, well, that's true. We started in fine arts in our both of our academic careers
Undergraduate.
as kids,
Yeah.
and when we got out of graduate school, we both wanted to just test out. We just wanted to build things. We were building at the before, and then we just we built things. We sort of jumped back into the academy after a couple of years of practice. And then really kind of began to enjoy, this crossover between what you practice and what you teach and how you do both. And so both have been incredibly rich experiences for us. And I think kind of, throughout the years, even, maybe it's even gotten richer where we really can work out these ideas and kind of engage students with the concepts.
But I think it's also just about kind of looking for opportunities. I mean, we didn't plan necessarily to have a gallery. It was, actually, maybe we're a little bit slow to figure it out, because we've been in our building for a long time. We're surrounded by galleries in the building, and often, especially in the fall, there are gallery openings on Thursday evenings, and we're often here working late, and people will kind of open our door and think it's a gallery, like, oh, sorry, I thought so. And it took us about, 6 years or 7 years to figure out, like, well, actually, there aren't that many architecture galleries in the city. There have been ones in the past, and then they've closed. And so we kind of started to think, like, we could do something really informal and just move our conference table out and let colleagues and people show their work, and have it as a way to gather. So it's also just about, like, being open to opportunity. I think, for better or worse, I think sometimes we haven't planned enough about where we think we're going, but we try to just stay open to, like, something that an opportunity that comes in front of us to grab it and see what happens.
There's so many in these different. This is a great question, actually. It's making us think that there's so many different avenues to investigate, and to be kind of part of architecture, to be part of the city, be part of the academy, be part of the conversation. Stella and I are also on different boards. Stella's on the Architectural League of New York City, and I'm on the AIA New York Chapter board. I'm on the executive committee as a vice president for professional development. And we then get to spend time with colleagues who are operating at these levels, discussing issues of the city, the issues of architecture, the issues of the day. You can imagine the conversations over the past 4 years of the issues. And that's an incredibly rich place for both of us to be in, and connected with.
And what about the teaching specifically? Do you find that is a way to explore in an academic setting the issues that you're addressing in practice, or is that a way
For sure.
Try out ideas? Yeah, Stella, I noticed you're teaching a studio on free libraries. So
yes, yeah, exactly. I taught one last year, and I'm just about to teach another one. And we have talked together, and David's done a lot of work on housing and publishing the book on NYCHA. So we, try and look for opportunities to teach studios that are also based on some of these programs, housing, free libraries, that are, that are important to us and that contribute to the city in these ways that, again, the sort of larger politics of the city and the inner workings of the city and how architecture can make a difference. And then looking obviously at a smaller scale. So absolutely. And sharing ideas with students is so inspiring, the mutual sharing that I think we really enjoy from the teaching experience.
So I'm looking a couple of questions here that have come in from the audience. Dorothea Ambert wrote, "I found another Wallace Stevens poem comes to mind, The Anecdote of the Jar. With the wilderness no longer wild, tamed by the jar. When looking at your last house in the forest, there's an inside-outside relationship that's more about apposition than transition and an exchange." Sorry, she says it's hard to do in less than 200 words.
Yeah.
I don't know, are you familiar with this Anecdote of the Jar, the Wallace Stevens poem, Anecdote of the Jar?
No, but
I am
get
not,
it. That's
but
nice.
yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
That's this idea of like containment.
I think that's what the question is about, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Maybe that should be the book number 3, the jars.
Yeah, the jar.
Yeah.
Eric Kospel asks, how does the transition to computer/technology in libraries instead of purely books affect the design of the spaces?
Yeah. That's a great question. And it varies from library to library. We find some libraries.
And year to year.
Yeah, exactly. We find some libraries to still be very active with their collection and to need a lot of bookshelves that they're still, their community, it really, they have an active collection that they need to keep. And then some of the other libraries, they really have a pretty minimal collection. I mean, they're circulating through the Brooklyn Public Library System or Queens Public Library System. And then in which case it's much more important to have a variety of like meeting rooms. So smaller meeting rooms for 2 people, another meeting rooms for 4, and then, multi-purpose rooms, and really providing a variety of experiences, giving even within the identity of the library itself in the community, but then often, there are teens, adult, preteens, often in children, and what they need to have a sense of place within the library itself. So we're kind of like creating macro and micro communities, like this sort of the larger community of the library and its relationship to the neighborhood, and then within the library itself, these smaller communities so that teens can come into a library and kind of feel like they've got their space. So it's interesting because in the libraries that don't stress or don't have the need for strong of a book collection, it's really about different types of meeting spaces. And it's similar in that sense to the academic spaces we were talking about, where it's not also about libraries just needing to be quiet. They're incorporating maker spaces, they're training programs, English as a second language. During tax season, there's they're advising people on filling out their tax forms. So it's really an education center. Some of them are doing after school programs for students. You have to incorporate a kitchenette for snacks. School lunch. I mean, libraries are becoming kind of the central community center. And so there are a lot of ways that they really do go beyond the book and then provide free internet service. So, they're kind of amazing.
But the book's not going anywhere, which is nice. The computers, the pressures in the library, these little, these 8,000 square foot little boxes are like bursting at the seams because they need all of the things that Stella talked about. They obviously have to have, computers, but the books are still really important to people. And also in, neighborhoods with a lot of different languages being spoken, the books need to then be in all of the languages too, which is pretty great.
Okay, a couple more questions. Karen Smith asks, as time has gone on, how would you say your creative style has changed or grown with styles and trends constantly evolving?
I think I mean, it's probably, I don't know if we have very good perspective on our own work, but I will say that periodically we sort of ask each other the question about what are some of our favorite projects. And sometimes it's like some of our really, really early projects have something that still resonates with us. I think it's just for all of us as architects, it's a process, and we're, each project is a study, and in one sense, we sometimes feel like we're turning over the same rock, just slightly differently. And then in other times we feel or we think that we're making kind of leaps into another direction. But that's kind of the fun part. I don't know about I don't know if we have a perspective on our own work enough. That's actually the joy of sometimes putting together a book or a portfolio or anything where you have to kind of, look at your own work and decide, like, not only what you're including, but what images of that you're including and how are you representing it. And those are also, that's a whole other design problem of just trying to create a narrative. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, I think even putting together a lecture like this evening where you needed to get the structure to work that comes many different ways from many different places.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So Todd Gannon is saying, no question, just a virtual high five, beautiful, intelligent work, elegantly presented. You make it look easy when it's clearly not. So,
thank you, that's very nice.
That's nice.
Noon Chunbik asks, right to light is really interesting. The idea of the right to light, or the, you had another good expression.
Form follows photon.
Form follows photons, there you go, thank you. Right to light is really interesting. How do you balance the thermal requirements in Ithaca with that objective in mind? So cold place, windows, cold, light, good.
Yeah.
Well, the project, met all the LEED silver criteria. So, we actually had to insulate a building that hadn't had much insulation before. Or I should say a space in a building that hadn't had much insulation. And the challenge there is how to not lose the character of this amazing, attic space, right? Sort of quote unquote, just an attic, but that's where all the bones are, right? And then we added other bones. So, we had to kind of do it carefully. And there's a lot of, it's a very tricky issue. The light issue, we used a very high insulating skylight product that was manufactured by a Velux company, but it was in a fiberglass frame as opposed to a metal frame. So the the heat loss around the perimeter, which is where you lose all the the heat all the time, was mitigated a lot. So that was, an important part of that project was how that skylight, those two big skylights were going to perform.
No, I mean, I think another nice thing about all of the projects was how, back to the idea of politics, how you were able to achieve that at many different scales. So in some cases, it was a material scale. I love the idea of the Lindsay boxes, but the one with the brick pattern on the outside where it sort of went from an enclosed space to an open space. In some cases, it had to do with circulation. We were talking about the Robin Evans essay. In some, it had to do with environmental qualities of the light and the sort of right to light. In others, it was structure where you took down the concrete shear walls and put up steel portal frames that allowed it to be open, but sort of seeing how these details that I think sometimes we look at as technical solutions is actually allowing for different social situations. I think that was a really nice sort of thread that you could pick out, whether it was a material or a detail or an environment or circulation, sort of a nice series of things.
Nice.
Thank you.
And those are all design opportunities, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what's exciting to us is it's like, how do we actually design that steel frame?
Well, and I think it's interesting, like David's teaching aside from studio, a seminar this semester on construction tech. And then that's a lot of what you're talking about, like that it's not design and then you have to solve the problem from technology or the mechanical systems, but like bringing these things in from the beginning, and it's all integrated, and there are design opportunities in trying to figure out the infrastructure. I mean, actually the Sibley Hall project at Cornell, when we were hired, it was an infrastructure project. We had to figure out how to thread an HVAC system in a historic building, and it was structurally compromised, as David had noted, because the structure of the masonry wall. So actually they were like, do you want to do this project? You know, one is for the architecture school, so your clients are going to be all architects, and there might not be that much design, but there's always design, and there's always opportunity for that. But it started as a kind of structural stabilizing and an infrastructure to thread an HVAC system in a historic building. But there's always opportunities.
But I think it's great to see that in the context of an architecture school, because we talk, we use this word integrated a lot. And we can put words to what it means, but it's often hard to put projects to show what it means. We talk about it, but we can't necessarily show how you do it. So I appreciate lots of examples of how you're doing it. So I have a few more questions. Brittany Wilson asks, do you find that your undergraduate degrees in fine arts had a large influence on your architectural work?
Yes.
I'll say. Yeah, I mean, we're constantly, not only just sort of going back to those sources, who are the artists and what are the issues that they're dealing with and have dealt with over the years, but just in our own training, like, just mark making or, line weights or the way something gets placed on a page, which you correlate to the way a building gets placed on a site. All of that kind of, training, let's say, from then and over the years, it just plays into what we do all day long, every day.
But I think also, that background has also kind of followed us in the sense of, I think, and we'll see this in the book, like most of where we look for inspiration or precedence is usually often outside of architecture. We look at architecture all the time, for sure, but we look a lot at film and artists, and as a way sometimes to just kind of break out of what we all sometimes approach a problem with, like, oh, well, these are the givens, and it's you can question that a little bit easier sometimes outside of your discipline. So we've found that to be helpful in terms of the process, often to kind of look towards film or art as a way to kind of, challenge things in a way that we can't often as architects, but it sometimes sparks something.
So we'll take one more question here from the chat. Caitlin Lux asks, what level of community engagement goes into the design process in terms of the library projects?
A fair amount, actually. We usually start with the librarian meetings, head librarians, and then the local librarians. Wonderfully, we're required in New York City, any public building, to go in front of the community board, often several times, to present the project to them, as well as in front of the Public Design Commission. So any public building goes through a series of processes with different sort of constituents of the community, the librarians, and then the kind of larger city community. So it's pretty involved, and it definitely makes the projects take longer. 8,000 square foot library can take several years just because of getting it built in the city. But we always kind of keep our eye on the prize of the project itself, and hopefully the good of providing a more open and welcoming library to a community. But it's pretty extensive, and again, wonderfully, by law, actually, because it's a public building. So.
Well, I think we can just close back to the anecdote of the jar. So apparently the whole poem fits within 200 words. So the poem is, I placed a jar in Tennessee and round it upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around it, no longer wild.
Nice.
Oh, beautiful. Wow.
Use that for the next, perhaps the next time you lecture here.
Yeah. And that sense of wildness. Like, where does that?
Out of control.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's fantastic. Thank
you both again. It's a pleasure to see the work.
Thanks so much, Andrew.
We really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the invitation. Hopefully soon, we can come out and visit you.
Absolutely.
We'd love to see the student work.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
All right.
hopefully we'll then expect an invitation for our final reviews and perhaps in person or perhaps through this format again.
We would love
Be
that.
great.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye. Thank you
Thanks.
all. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for the questions.